In 1862, the American Civil War was raging. Far to the west, California faced a different danger, being abandoned by the nation. From New York to San Francisco, the sea route around Cape Horn took 6 months. The overland route was equally dangerous and slow. The east and west were cut off. California even talked of independence. A unified America was being torn apart by distance. The only answer to this growing divide was a transcontinental railroad. Building this railroad required an astronomical amount of money. The federal government, emerging from civil war, had an empty treasury. The government had no money, but capitalists did. Why would they invest in such a bottomless pit? A bold plan was born: government policy, capital money, land and bonds would lure investment for the railroad. That plan created the largest railroad bubble in American history, triggering the first financial crisis on Wall Street. Welcome to Finance Traveler, exploring epic stories of money, power, and capital across time. On May 10, 1869, the golden spike was driven. The financial bubble had only just begun to inflate. As government struggled, California businessmen saw opportunity. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker formed Central Pacific Railroad. They needed capital and government support. They sent representatives to Washington with their railroad plan. They painted a grand vision for Congress and President Lincoln: unify the nation, strengthen defense, open the West. Their proposal was simple: government policy and land grants. Companies would raise money by issuing stocks and bonds. On July 1, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law. It offered extraordinarily generous terms. The terms reflected sophisticated financial logic. Government granted vast land for every mile of track laid. From 1850 to 1871, railroad companies received over 175 million acres of public land, larger than Texas. Even more important, the government provided direct financial support. They issued 30-year bonds at 6% interest. The subsidy per mile varied: $16,000 on flat land, $48,000 in Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada. That structure reflected financial logic of risk pricing. More difficult terrain meant higher return on capital. The act also granted financial privileges. Companies could issue first mortgage bonds equal to government bonds. This meant borrowing from investors using future railroad revenue as collateral. The first mortgage bond was precursor of modern securitization. Favorable policies awakened dormant capital. Wall Street, European syndicates, wealthy merchants, ordinary people rushed to buy. They believed the great artery would bring limitless wealth. Capital flooded in, providing steady funds for construction. The profit motive drove fierce competition. Whichever company reached the meeting point first could claim more land and subsidies. The Union Pacific pushed westward. The Central Pacific faced the deadly challenge of the Sierra Nevada. To overcome the mountains, the Central Pacific hired about 12,000 Chinese workers. They did the most dangerous work. The railroad, originally scheduled for 14 years, was completed in just 7, driven by the force of capital. But behind the glory of construction lay a massive financial fraud. Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, created a shell company called the Crédit Mobilier of America. Its purpose was simple: funnel all profits of railroad construction to insiders, leaving government and investors to bear the risk. Here is how it worked. Union Pacific awarded contracts to its own Crédit Mobilier, whose shareholders were the same men. Crédit Mobilier charged exorbitant fees, and the railroad paid those fees by issuing bonds and stocks. Federal subsidies and railroad bonds all flowed into the pockets of Crédit Mobilier. The results were shocking. Union Pacific signed contracts worth $47 million. Crédit Mobilier spent only $26 million. That meant $21 million in profits were pocketed by the insiders. In today's language, that is called self-dealing. In the language of the time, it was called legal. Durant and his partners did not invest a single dollar, yet walked away with tens of millions in profit. To ensure subsidies, Crédit Mobilier managers used Congressman Oakes Ames as intermediary, selling shares at par value. They sold to over 30 members of Congress, the vice president, and even relatives of President Grant. Those politicians holding shares naturally voted to keep the subsidies flowing. In 1872, the New York Sun exposed the scandal. Ames testified and named names. Congress launched an investigation. The House censured Ames and James Brooks. But most politicians escaped punishment. The congressional farce ended when the two major parties agreed to drop the matter. The Crédit Mobilier scandal severely damaged investor confidence in American railroad bonds. European investors feared their money would be looted by insiders, leaving them with nothing but money-losing railroads. Another key figure in the story of the Transcontinental Railroad was the Philadelphia banker J. Cook. Cook made his name during the Civil War. He broke government bonds into small denominations and sold them to ordinary Americans. He sold $500 million in bonds to 5% of Northern households. Lincoln paid for the war because of Cook. He was the first true investment banker in America, actively creating a market for bonds. After the war, Cook became a close friend of General Grant, who later became president. He turned his attention to railroads. His plan was to build a railroad from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast, to Seattle. But Cook faced several problems. His government subsidies were far smaller than those given to Central Pacific. Second, he was terrible at bribing Congress. His managers naively believed Congress would vote for subsidies out of public interest. Worse, the Crédit Mobilier scandal had already made investors deeply suspicious of railroad bonds. By mid-1871, the Northern Pacific was running out of money. When financial titans run into trouble, they borrow and gamble. Cook was no exception. He poured all of his bank's money into Northern Pacific bonds. It was still not enough. Research points to the root cause of the Panic of 1873, overexpansion of railroad investment and sudden withdrawal of European capital. German investors, flush with French war reparations, poured money into American railroads, but when the German economy liberalized, they turned home. American railroad financing suddenly dried up. Cook collapsed because the European money he counted on never arrived. On September 18, 1873, J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy. The bank suspended payments. When news reached the New York Stock Exchange, brokers were stunned. An eyewitness wrote, "They stood there as if struck by lightning. Then everyone began frantically notifying banks of the failure. Short sellers dumped shares, and prices fell at a terrifying speed. Some men went bankrupt and cursed. Some wept. Others walked out of Wall Street without a word. Some joked, then sought money." Cook's bankruptcy triggered a chain reaction. Stock prices collapsed. Bank runs began. Railroad companies failed. The financial crisis of 1873 was one of the worst economic depressions in American history. People simply called it the Great Depression. The depression lasted 65 months until 1879. Railroad construction jobs for non-agricultural workers plummeted from 10 to 2%. Unemployment in New York City reached 25%. Over 100,000 people lost jobs, factories closed by the hundreds, thousands of workers, many Civil War veterans, became homeless wanderers. The words tramp and bum entered everyday American speech. The shadow of the Depression fell on every ordinary life. In New York, thousands of homeless people crowded outside soup kitchens. They stood in long lines for a bowl of thin porridge. A reporter wrote, "Ragged men sat by the roadside, eyes hollow, losing all hope." In Philadelphia, a charity distributed over 2,000 free meals daily, yet could not feed all the hungry. In Chicago, families evicted for not paying rent built makeshift shacks in parks to sleep. These shantytowns were called Cook's Towns, because it was J. Cook's bankruptcy that had cost those families their homes. A jobless mechanic wrote to his local newspaper. He wrote, "I was once a respectable man. I had a job, a house, and savings. Now I have nothing. My savings disappeared when the bank failed. My house was taken by the bank. My job is gone. I do not know what to do." Such stories played out across the country. The whole nation seemed frozen. No one knew what to do. Looking back, we see a striking pattern. 3 attempts to build a transcontinental railroad ended very differently. The southern route never received private money and was never built. The Central Pacific used its construction company to pocket tens of millions. The Northern Pacific went bankrupt and dragged the entire American economy into a deep depression. But after the dust settled, America did have a transcontinental railroad. You could board a train in New York and ride to San Francisco. Without enormous government subsidies, the railroad would not have been built for another 20 years. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad allowed goods, people, and capital to flow freely. Western minerals and grain moved east. Eastern manufactured goods moved west. The American economy was finally linked. It entered a period of rapid growth. From a financial perspective, the railroad meant something even deeper. It marked America's transformation from a peripheral market dependent on European capital to an independent financial system, one that could generate and circulate its own capital. The widespread issuance of railroad bonds introduced ordinary Americans to capital markets. They learned to invest, to take risks, and to use other people's money to grow their own businesses. But what was the cost of all this? $21 million looted by insiders, thousands of investors wiped out, 65 months of depression, countless families losing their homes. The transcontinental bubble teaches us a lesson. When capital is left unchecked, when greed overrides the rules, a great project becomes a tool for the few to plunder the many. And when the bubble bursts, it is always ordinary people who pay the price. Subscribe to Finance Traveler. We trace the flow of capital across centuries and help you navigate the future with clarity.